Hello, welcome back to the place where history moves slowly, and the voices of the world are softer than usual. Tonight, we will not talk about victory or glory or who was bravest. Settle down a quiet seat. Let this lullaby flow softly along with the story. Let the sounds of nature soothe your weary mind, and let history lull you to sleep tonight. If you like this kind of journey, slow, dusty, silent, and too human to be written in a school book, please hit subscribe. We will continue to explore the lonely roads left by time. Now, take a deep breath. Close your eyes, if you will, and let this story begin. There was a president who read too many books. His name was Thomas Jefferson. He read about rivers, about the West, about the sea that might be, might not be. And one day he said, "What if we sent two men over there, to a place that had no name, no map, and no way home?" The two men did not ask why. They simply packed their supplies and wrote everything down, like children caught up in an overly long school expedition. One was Meriwether Lewis. He liked to note the temperature of the water and the color of the soil. The other was William Clark. He preferred to draw the shape of rivers that no one would see. They set off with 33 men, but they had no clear destination in mind. Only one direction, west. The journey would last 2 years, but they did not know that. They knew only one thing: whatever happened, write it all down. May-June 1804. The first day, the boat nearly sank. The second day, a crewman came down with diarrhea. The third day, Lewis recorded high wind, couldn't row, stopped and waited for the wind to die. And they waited 4 hours, then 5, then nothing. Clark sat on the edge of the boat, fiddling with a knot that never became anything. Lewis observed deer footprints in the mud and wrote about them for 2 full pages. Strange tracks, 3 toes, might be deer, might not be. They sleep on the ground, without pillows, without dry blankets, and without knowing whether they are still in the right place. But there is no right place here. Only the river, rising, turning, repels them like an old snake that doesn't like to be disturbed. I noted the color of the river today: gray. Yesterday, dark gray. Tomorrow, maybe still gray. Some nights, they were awakened by the sound of animals. It was never clear what animals. Sometimes wolves. Sometimes just the wind, moving the leaves like soft footsteps. Clark tried to sleep with one eye open. Lewis wrote the dream. "I dreamed I was walking, but I didn't know where, just kept walking." The fourth day, they found a raccoon. The fifth day, they ran out of salt. The sixth day, they sang a song without words, because everyone had forgotten the words. But they wrote it down anyway, because if they didn't write it down, then it never happened, and they couldn't stand it if it never happened. People they didn't understand, but they had to survive. Together, they had been rowing for 5 weeks, sometimes pushing the boat more than rowing. The Missouri River was beginning to resemble a maze that no one had made, only left to grow and rot. twisting, narrowing, widening, then sinking into swamp. The day was hot, but it wasn't a brave heat, more like a heat that was too lazy to move. The wind had stopped. The water wasn't moving, and their skin was sticky like glue. Lewis wrote, "We didn't talk, but we all felt the same thing. The river didn't like us." Then they saw someone, a figure in the distance, standing on a small hill, not moving. They approached. The figure did not run. He just stared, without language, without gestures, only unblinking eyes. Clark raised his hand. The figure did not reply. He just slowly disappeared behind the bushes. Lewis noted, "I don't know if he was real, but I wanted to write it down. Otherwise, I'd forget that I'd ever been seen by someone." They began to meet small groups of people, appearing on the shore, walking slowly, sometimes coming with gifts, sometimes just silent. They did not understand each other's language. They talked with their hands, with their eyes, with small objects like beads, mirrors, and dried corn kernels. They gave gifts without knowing if they would be returned. They laughed because they did not know what to say. Clark began to draw the faces he saw, but he always repeated them 3 times because he could not remember the actual shape of the eyes. One night, they set up camp near a small village. The people there sat with them, said nothing, just sat, eating together, as if they knew that words sometimes only made things go further. Someone played a flute. Unclear song, what? The notes circle, like a river that keeps returning to where it started. Lewis wrote, "I don't know who they are, but I feel calmer here than anywhere since we started." The next morning, they left again. No goodbyes, no hugs, just a little wave from a child on the riverbank. And the river became silent again, and full of mosquitoes. I was bitten 42 times in one night. Clark recorded the number of bites each night, not for scientific purposes, just to convince himself that the night had really happened. One day, they sat under a tree. Everyone was silent. They were exhausted, but not because of the distance, but because they didn't know how far they had gone and how much was left. Lewis opened his notebook, wrote a sentence, and then closed it again. I forgot what it was like to hear the sounds of the city. Clark drew a picture of a bird he had seen 5 minutes earlier. And then it flew away and never came back. That day, they found a deer skull, half buried in the mud. Lewis picked it up, smelled the earth, and wrote, "This thing probably knows which way is west better than we do." In August-October 1804, when the ground began to rise, and everything they carried seemed too heavy. Day 112, or 113, Lewis stopped counting after day 94. The river began to recede, and the ground began to rise. Not like a mountain, but like an old shoulder that could never really rest. They did not row anymore. They began to push, pull, lift. They brought boats, but there was no water. They brought guns, but there was nothing they wanted to shoot. They brought notebooks, but there was nothing they wanted to write. Lewis wrote, "Today We walked 15 miles, but I do not remember the scenery. Clark began to talk to himself about the shape of the antlers, about the length of the deer's shadow in the evening, about how some deer might never know they are deer. He drew the antlers, long, branched, confusing, and every night he redrawn them. I think these antlers are wrong, he said on the 7th night. No one knew why the antlers were important to him, but no one asked him either, because everyone had run out of questions and out of answers since the 3rd week. Their knees began to buzz. Sometimes they felt like they were beating on their own. Sometimes they felt numb, like rocks. Meriwether Lewis began to talk to her knees. Please hold on, we're not done yet. But his knees did not respond. They just throbbed silently, like a foreign object stuck to his body. They climbed the endless hill to see what was beyond it, and found just another hill. The 114th night, a crewman fell flat on the rocks, not badly, just exhausted, but he laughed to himself, and everyone laughed along, not because it was funny, but because it felt like the only human sound they could make. Lewis wrote, I laughed too, but I don't know why. Maybe I just wanted to feel alive. The 116th day, they saw a bison in the distance, a giant, silent, standing in the grass too tall to see through. Clark raised his hand to draw, but did not, he said. I have drawn one like that before. And they sat, still, staring at the bison until it was gone. And they were still sitting. That night, the wind came, for the first time in a week, and their tent lifted a little. Someone whispered, the wind is from the west, but no one knew whether it was true or just hope disguised as good news. November 1804, March 1805, when the snow falls too early and the day never really begins. They arrived at Mandan on the eve of winter, or perhaps winter came to them, like an uninvited guest, bringing wind and silence and a frozen sound from the sky. The Mandan had already built their own mud houses that kept them warm. They knew the snow was coming. They did not panic, because to them, cold was not an enemy, just something that was there, like rocks, like night. Lewis and Clark began building a fort, not because they needed a fort, but because they needed a reason to get up every morning. They cut wood, laid planks, made walls, and sat inside and still shivered. Lewis recorded, Day 127. I began to lose feeling in my hands, but I could still write, so I wrote. The days became short. The sun rose as if thinking twice, then set without giving a reason. And the nights became long, like the road home that forgot its route. Hour after hour, they just sat, listening to the sound of cracking wood, the sound of their own breathing, the sound of someone coughing in another corner of the room, the same cough every night until it felt like the ticking of a clock. I think tonight is colder than last night, but I'm not sure. Maybe it's just that my body is more tired. Clark drew the shape of snow falling on a branch, but after 20 drawings, they all looked the same. He crossed them all out and fell asleep with his pencil still in his hand. They ate dried meat, drank snow water, heated slowly, and sometimes just sat there, hoping tomorrow would be different, but knowing it wouldn't. I talked to a dog today. It didn't answer, but I felt heard. Louis loved the Mandan dog that came every morning. The dog was quiet, didn't beg, didn't lick, just sat there, staring at the same spot for an hour straight. Sometimes, Louis stared in the same direction, hoping there was something there. But there was nothing, only snow. Sacagawea gave birth in silence. Louis recorded it in the shortest sentence he ever wrote. A child was born today. The world has not changed. No party. No name for weeks. Only a small breath puffed in the frozen air. Clark held him for a while, then gave him back, because the boy was too warm and he was afraid his hands would make him cold. Day 148. The sun shone for 8 full minutes. People came out of the fort, just to make sure the sky wasn't dead, then went back in, because the wind was colder than anyone remembered. I write these lines just to fill the page, but I have nothing to say, and time went on, slowly, then too slowly. Then it didn't feel like it was going at all. April, June, 1805, she took her child. She knew the way and never said, "Follow me." Winter reluctantly went away, like someone who forgets their coat and goes back in, and goes out again, and stands in the doorway too long. But eventually, the snow melted. The ground showed itself again, and the river began to move, slowly, as if remembering how to be a river. They began to walk again, or rather, they began to be carried away again. Sacagawea walked with them, but was not part of them. She was not given a rank, was not called lieutenant or captain or sergeant. She was simply there. She carried her child in a deerskin sling. The baby rarely cried, sometimes only moaned softly, as if she knew the world was too big to protest. Sacagawea did not talk much, not because she was afraid, not because it is forbidden, but because it is not necessary. She points in a certain direction. They follow, and they do not know why they believe, but they believe. Louis wrote, "Today, Sacagawea rescued my notes from the water. I do not know how. I did not even realize I had dropped the paper." She knows the names of rivers, even though they are not written on the map. She knows behind which hills there is clear water, and behind which rocks, snakes usually sleep during the day. She knows the way without showing it, and knows when to be quiet, so as not to scare the deer passing by. Clark looks at her from a distance. Sometimes he wants to ask, "What are you thinking?" But he knew the question was too small for her. Sacagawea looked at the ground like someone reading an old book, not in a hurry, not afraid of getting bored, because she knew the stories by heart, and the baby on her back grew, without ever knowing that it was crossing the world. An inch a day. The baby laughed this morning. I haven't heard a sound like that in months. Louis and Clark laid out their maps every night, adding new points, crossing out dead ends. But Sacagawea looked only at the sky and knew when to stop, she slept by the fire, didn't talk. Sometimes she sang softly to her child, a song that even the night could hear softly too. Day 183. A bear appeared in the distance. Everyone panicked. Sacagawea stood still and said one sentence, "Don't run, it's just passing by." And the bear did just pass by. Lewis wrote, "I began to understand that some people don't need to talk to lead." Sacagawea never said the word goal. She just walked because she knew in this very big world, a goal is something that moves, and we can only approach it without ever really arriving. July, August 1805, up, and up, but the peak was always behind another peak. They started climbing, not like climbing the hill behind the house, but like trying to climb the back of the earth that had grown tired of supporting the sky for too long. The mountains were called the Rockies, but to them, that was just another name for a mistake. The mistake of thinking that west was a direction. The mistake of believing that the world could be mapped. This was not the road Jefferson had in mind, I am sure. Lewis wrote, with hands shaking from cold and hunger and the burden of an unhelpful map. Every morning they woke, not to see the sun, but to see if the mountain was still there. And the answer was always, yes, the mountain was not gone. It did not change, only became more numerous. One peak finished, another peak awaited, and behind it, there was always another peak. Clark began counting the stones in his shoe. That day, 3. Tomorrow, 5. The day after that, 21. He didn't throw them away. He just shifted his position, because the pain helped remind him that he was still walking. They ran out of meat. They ate bitter roots they didn't know the name of. They ate mushrooms that didn't grow in any part of the world they knew. They drank water from slowly melting ice and wrote it all down. I ate something today. It tasted like wet paper, but I'm still alive. Sacagawea kept walking, carrying her baby, across a river of ice that didn't know anyone was crossing it. She didn't slip, didn't gasp, didn't ask, "When will we get there?" because she knew there was no answer. Her child was asleep on her back, and the world kept rising. At night, Lewis looked up at the sky, but the sky was also confused. He wrote, "I think I saw a new star tonight, or maybe I've forgotten the shape of the old one." Clark tried to draw a mountain, but there was no paper wide enough. He stopped drawing and began to scribble on the page with charcoal, black, solid, shapeless. "I don't know what to write." Day 204. A crew member collapsed mid-climb. Lewis simply said, "Let him sleep. We want to do that too." But they kept going, because there was nowhere else to go. No going back, and no going forward. Only up. Dar November 1805, and no one greeted them there. Day 259, or 260. No one was sure anymore. The date had lost its shape. They climbed the last hill with bodies that did not want to follow, and beyond that hill, the sea they were looking for, the sea the president had spoken of, the sea that made two people leave everything, the sea that for some reason said nothing. Today, we saw endless water, but I felt nothing. Lewis. The water moved, but did not approach. The wind from the west brought the smell of salt. and a coldness different from the mountains. It was an open cold, not piercing, but more like ignoring. They stood on the edge of the sand, silent, no cheering, no crying, no hugging each other. They just stared. Someone tried to smile, but their lips were stiff because of the salt, because of the frost, because the body had forgotten how to feel successful. We have reached the end, but there is no line that shows that this is the end. Clark drew a coastline. He wrote, "This is the Pacific," but his letters were shaky because his hands were shaking, because he didn't know if he believed the words. Lewis wrote 3 pages. Then he burned them. He said, "No one can describe this place, so it's better not to try." They set up a small tent under a tree that had no name. They watched the water for 3 days. No ships, no people, no welcome. This sea doesn't wait for us. That night, they made a fire and didn't talk. Sacagawea stared at the horizon. The child began to learn to walk on the sand. The footprints were small and disappeared as soon as the waves came in. Lewis wrote, "I don't think anywhere in the world knew we were here." 1806, and many years after, but home had become a strange place. They went home by another road because they knew there was no point in repeating a route they no longer wanted to remember. The mountains were behind them now. The river flowed in a direction they did not have to fight. The sky was clear, but their feelings were not. Lewis wrote, "We were on our way home, but I didn't know what home meant yet." People greeted them in town, with applause, with speeches, with a small feast full of sweets, but they sat in silence, because the sounds of the forest still rang in their ears, because the taste of mud lingered in their mouths. "I can't eat soft bread. It tastes like the stuff of dreams." Clark tried to sleep in the soft bed, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw deer antlers, or the outline of a river, or the bison that stared at him from a distance. Sacagawea did not join them until the end. She lived in a quieter place. No one knew what she thought about the sea, or about 2 men who did not know which way to go. Lewis wanted to write her a letter, but he did not know what to write and to whom to send it. "I think I learned a lot, but I don't know what." Years passed. Maps were updated, rivers were named, mountains were redrawn. Lewis was made governor. Then he disappeared, slowly, not from the world, but from within himself. Clark married, had children, but sometimes he sat on the edge of his bed and redrawn the shape of the horns, without knowing why. I don't think we discovered a new world. We just discovered that the world doesn't care about being discovered. And all their notes about the weather, about birds, about cloud shapes and wind directions were kept in filing cabinets, not read, not remembered, but not thrown away, like voices that linger in the night, long after people have stopped talking. And that is the story of 2 people who walked too far, for too long, and wrote everything down so that later we could hear it and slowly fall asleep. If you've ever lain awake and wondered, how did the ancients build cities? Who decided that alleys were narrow, streets were wide, and markets were always near temples? Then tonight, we will slowly creep beneath the bricks of history, walking through the quiet alleys, where people thousands of years ago once sat, maybe under the shade of a tree, or maybe on the edge of a dry ditch they called a drainage system. We won't hear a king speak. We won't see a cavalry, because tonight we will follow the slow steps of someone who drew a straight line in the sand and said, "This is where the city will be." This is the story of a city. Not the city you know, but the city that was built before people knew what a city was. Sit back, get into your sleeping position. Let the artificial rain and the sound of crickets in the background disguise the world outside. And let me take you slowly towards ancient city planning, a long, boring journey, full of nameless plans and stacked stones for no reason. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you like to fall asleep to stories like this, or if you want to be read to you one night about public toilets in Mesopotamia or the city zoning system in Mohenjo-Daro. We'll get to all of that, but not now. Now, we start with the bare ground. There was no city, just a flat expanse between two slow rivers, a river that was in no hurry, seeking no sea, and not caring if humans were trying to live beside it. The ground was clay, the color of dried bean porridge. It was cracked, but it did not split, a crack that looked like a small river that would never flow. A man came. He had no name. We have no record of him, but we know he stood there because his footprints were left beneath the layers of mud, which dried and were buried by time. He was not seeking glory. He was simply looking for a place where the water was not too far away and the ground was not too hard to dig. Then he drew, with a wooden stick, a straight line, then another, forming a right angle. The angle was nothing special. There was no statue of a king there, just a line marking the future. That's where the first ditch would be built. Not a river, not a canal, just a ditch, 1 step wide, 2 spans deep. He didn't dig it himself. Some people came later. They didn't know they were making history. They just didn't want the rain to flood their beds. They dug. The soil was lifted, thrown aside. 2 storks watched them from a distance. There was no ceremony, no drums, just the sound of wooden shovels pounding mud. Then the line grew longer, more than one line. It became a network, like cracks in the mud, but on purpose, like patterns on snakeskin, but made with a simple logic. I want to be able to walk from here to there, without having to cross dirty water. That was the beginning of a city. Not a palace, not a temple, not a town square, but a ditch, a sewer. That is the backbone of civilization. A few weeks later, they built their first house. Walls of mud brick, bricks molded one by one, dried under the too patient sun, then stacked, without cement, without eternal intention, but strong enough to last for several seasons. The house was small, 1 room, no door in the front. The door was on the side, facing a direction where the sun was less fierce. Inside, there was no furniture, just a slightly higher mound of earth, perhaps a bed, and a clay bowl that had no contents, because nothing was left behind, only shapes. They did not know that thousands of years later, humans would discuss in air-conditioned rooms about how orderly their cities were, that archaeologists would be amazed because their water channels were straight, because their roads were parallel, because their houses were built facing the wind. They just lived and chose the easiest path. In the ditch, the least smelly. When night fell, they slept on mats beside a small, barely extinguished stove. And the small town, that was not yet called a city, breathed softly under stars that had no name yet. The street was not wide. It was only wide enough for two people to walk side by side, as long as they weren't carrying a water vessel. The street had no name. There were no signs, no house numbers, no security post, just an alley that led to nowhere. But everyone in town knew where the street led, to their house, or to the small market, or to a place where water flowed, but wasn't drinkable. The houses were built in a row. There were no fences, no backyards, but they all seemed to know what was a comfortable distance between one house and the next. A distance enough to walk, but not enough to run, because no one was in a hurry. There was no place they had to get to quickly. The street was dusty, the same dust every day, the dust that stuck to the feet of children, running aimlessly among the piles of bricks. And if you walk slowly on a morning that is too still, you can smell it. Not the smell of flowers, not the smell of food, but the smell of sewage, the smell that comes from the open drains, flowing lazily along the sides of the road. But no one complains, not because they have no sense of smell, but because they are used to it. The smell is not a nuisance. It is part of the city. The smell of sewage is the sound of the city. It indicates that people live here, that behind those mud walls, someone is cooking. Someone has just taken a bath. Someone has just defecated. Some houses have small wells. They are not deep, but they are enough to draw a bucket of water every morning. The water is not clean, but it is cleaner than the ditch. They store it in clay containers, placed in the corners of the houses, not for drinking, but for washing hands, or for washing feet, or flush the kitchen ashes, which is no longer hot, but it still smells like charcoal. There are no big windows, no balcony, no view. The houses were not designed to be seen from the outside, but from within. Inside it, there is the main room and a small space in the back. Sometimes there are wooden stairs towards a flat roof where they dry cloth, or sleep when the night is too hot, or sit and looked up at the sky, which is always the same. And that road, never quiet, but it's also never crowded. There's always one person passing by, sometimes carrying a basket. Sometimes it doesn't bring anything. Sometimes it brings stories, which is only whispered to the neighbors, then disappeared into the mud wall. No loud noise, only the sound of leather sandals hitting the ground, the sound of the jug shaking, and the sound of water dripping from the stone channel towards a small ditch that flows to a place never mentioned. This city is a symphony built from silence, from repetition, from the unchangingness of small things, and from boredom that feels like home. Night falls, not with red, but with the smell of the kitchen, with the sound of a wooden spoon stirring bean porridge, with long shadows from the walls of the house that dance slowly on the dusty ground. The road is still there, but it becomes slower, because people's steps become lazier, and because the night calls them home. This city doesn't have a name yet, but it already has a pattern. It already has a rhythm. It already has a smell. It already has a direction that can be remembered, even without a map. And that's enough, because city planning, in this day and age, is not about documents, but about habits. and the silence that is repeated every day until it becomes home. In the middle of the city, or something resembling a middle, there is a slightly larger place. No markers, no gates, just an open space, which seems never empty. People come there, not by order, but by habit. They carry baskets filled with nuts, or pieces of dried fish, or flat stones that they say can be used for sharpening. They have no price tags, no tables, no shouts of promotions, just a dirt floor and shabby cloth on which the merchandise is laid out, and every exchange is accompanied by a short murmur and a nod of the head. This market doesn't look like an economic center, but this is the heart of the city, because this is where information spreads, stories travel, news changes hands, and whispers about the weather or a lost goat echo faster than the flow of a river. The market is not a place to stay. No permanent buildings, no taxes, no registers. But if you stand there long enough, you get to know everyone without needing to know their names. Not far away, there is a building, a little taller than a regular house. The walls are thicker, and in front of it is a stone, flat, placed intentionally. But there is no writing. People call that place a temple, but they don't worship idols. There is no sound of prayer. There is no incense. Just one empty room, kept clean, though never used. Every morning, an old woman comes, brings water, sprays the dirt floor, then sits down, silent, stares at the shadows of the trees, slowly moving in the wind. That place, maybe it's not a temple, maybe it's just an empty place, too empty to be respected. Because in a city like this, built without a map, every unused space becomes sacred space. And this city knows that not every place has to be useful. Some places just exist to remind us that not everything has to be explained. Then there are other spaces, alleys that were built but never passed, small houses that seem to have been built just to be left empty. Maybe they were abandoned before being occupied. Maybe they are reserves, or maybe those empty spaces are part of the plan, a silent plan, unwritten but understood by everyone, because even a city needs a place to stay. And the city grows, not up, but sideways, crawling slowly like moss, adjusting to the land, to the river, to the wind, to anything they can't change. They don't force a form, they follow the flow. And that is why the city survives, because it is not the product of one man's will, but the result of the habits of many, too busy living to have time to plan for the future. Security without fortresses. There are no walls, no tall gates, no watchtowers looking into the distance, no whistles, no large stones lined up in rows. But the city is still safe, and everyone knows when they are in and when they have stepped out. The city's borders are not lines, not ditches, not wooden fences, but changes, small, gradual changes. The ground becomes harder, the houses become more sparse, the roads become paths, then the paths become tracks, and then the city is no more. A few children often play on the border, throwing pebbles, seeing who can reach the furthest point without actually going outside. Because even though there are no warnings, no prohibitions, everyone knows that out there is not their place. There are no soldiers, there was no night watchman, but there was an old man who sat every day at the last intersection before the road turned into a field. He carried no weapon. He carried only a mat and a water jug. Sometimes he said hello, sometimes he didn't, but he was always there. He wasn't a watchman, but as long as he sat there, people felt safe enough not to be afraid. No one knows who first decided not to build a wall. Maybe they just didn't have a reason. Maybe they were too busy building houses. Or maybe they knew that security didn't come from stones, but from the unchanging rhythm of the day, from the sound of running water, from the familiar smell of the kitchen, from the footsteps you knew by heart, from hearing them every morning. Sometimes a stranger would come, he would be seen, from his hesitant steps, from the way he would look at each door as if waiting for someone to come out. But the city doesn't reject the stranger. It just doesn't know what to say, so they let him pass, or sit, or stay. And if he stays long enough, the city begins to consider him part of its invisible walls. And so the city survives, with no fortifications, with no warning bells, with no monumental architecture, only through repetition, with habit, with silence, and through spaces left alone, so that no one feels confined, because a city without boundaries is a city that slowly limits itself with contentment, planning for what has not happened. There is one building that is a little bigger. It is rectangular in shape. The walls are thicker than a regular house. There are no windows. The door is small, and it never opens wide. People call it a barn, or a warehouse, or a place to store something that is not needed now, but will be needed later. No one lives in it, but someone always takes care of it. Every morning, someone will come, bringing a broom made of coconut fiber, sweeping away the dust, checking the roof, sometimes knocking on the walls to make sure there are no mice. He never opens the barn unless it is absolutely necessary, because opening the barn is admitting that we are lacking something, and that is something this city doesn't like. Inside the barn, the smell of time is stored. There are clay sacks filled with grains. There are tools that are not yet broken, but are stored for a future time. There is dry wood that has not yet been burned, and rope that has not yet been used to tie anything. Each object has no meaning on its own, but together they form a very silent hope. Because in the ancient city, there is no calendar, no annual agenda, no to-do list. There is only the sky and the seasons and the feeling that comes silently that something will change. And that is what the barn is for, to store not only objects, but possibilities. Sometimes a person comes to the barn for no reason. He just stands in front of the door and listens. Not a voice from inside, because the barn makes no sound, but the voice of himself asking, "Do I need anything today?" And if not, he goes home without opening anything. No armed guards, no big padlocks, because this city is not afraid of thieves, because this city believes that if someone steals from the barn, they must be in dire need, and that is not a crime. It is just our failure to notice sooner. The barn, like the wall, is not designed to stand out, but to blend in. It is not the center of the city, but a still point where all paths silently converge. Because in the middle of a city that lives from day to day, the barn is the only space that lives for the day that has yet to come. And there we are, in front of a door that is rarely opened, hearing the wind passing by, watching the sun's shadow move slowly across the ground. This city knows how to prepare without worrying, knows how to store without feeling deprived, And perhaps that is the oldest form of planning, making peace with waiting. Designing cities for filth. Ancient cities were not built for glory. They were built for living, and living means eating, drinking, and shitting. One place for all of that. And sometimes not too far apart. There was a small building, no doors, half a roof, and in the floor there was a hole. It wasn't deep, but enough, and there wasn't one hole, but two, sometimes three, sometimes more. The place wasn't named, but everyone knew its name, a place where people went when they couldn't wait any longer. Sometimes morning, sometimes night. People would come, slowly, bringing a jug of water and a piece of cloth, not to bathe, not to purify themselves, just to wash away a little shame. There were no dividers between the holes. There were no partitions, but no one looked at each other, because everyone knew this city was built with understanding, not surveillance. The water channel started from here. The hole flowed through the stone, through a channel built of dried clay, and it kept going, away from the house, away from the market, away from the barn, but it never really went away, because the smell was still there. The smell lingered in the morning, when the dew had not yet dried, and the wind was still reluctant to move. The smell came like a memory, too honest to forget, but no one was bothered, because the smell was a sign that the city was still functioning, that the system was still working, that the bodies were still alive. The channel was not fancy, but it was straight, and it was connected. There was no engine, there was no cover, but there was a principle. All dirty water had to go away, but they are not allowed to be wild. They are given a path, like a small river that is not allowed to turn, and because of that, the city remains clean, not because it smells, but because it is orderly. Sometimes the drain gets clogged, leaves, dirt, or something that shouldn't be there, and when that happens, someone gets down with their hands, with a cloth in their mouth, and with enough determination to touch something they don't want to admit. They are called cleaners, but no one praises them, because the city doesn't give titles. It only gives jobs, and the smell is part of the job. Public bathrooms, drains, stones that are wet every morning, and holes that are never named. All of that is the invisible foundation of this city, because a city can only be called worthy, not when its palace is magnificent, but when someone can relieve themselves without fear, without being seen, and without waiting too long. When the city chooses to stay still, this city once touched the river, but it didn't become a sailor. It once saw water flowing, but it didn't flow with it. At the eastern end of town, there is a small pier, made of stone, arranged not too neatly. One side juts out a little into the water, just enough for one boat, but the boat never gets far. It's only used to cross, or fish, or haul wood from the other side of the river. There are no sails, no shipping lanes, no maps, because this city doesn't want to leave. It's had enough. Sometimes the wind comes, pushing the water to the shore, making small ripples at the foot of the pier, and people sit there, looking in the opposite direction, not because they want to leave, but because there's nothing else to look at. The boat is tied with a rope. The rope is old, but it's not replaced, because it never breaks. And if it ain't broke, why fix it? Here, the water is not a path, it's a boundary. a soft line that forms the edge of the city, and everyone knows that they don't have to cross that boundary unless they absolutely have to. Old-fashioned city planning wasn't about expansion. It was about understanding where to stop. The balance of nothing and too much between the houses. There is an empty space, not built, not planted, not made into a road. The space is unused, but not erased, like a pause between two sentences, which makes both understandable. Children sometimes play there, but not every day. Adults rarely pass by, but sometimes they sit for a while. If the day is too hot, no benches, no fences, no trees, just dirt. Sometimes rocky, sometimes flat, sometimes a little higher, because the leftover dirt from the buildings is piled up there. This empty space is a form of unwritten planning, because a city that is too crowded cannot breathe. And the ancient city knew that even emptiness needs to be maintained. A city without a center, but not without direction. No palace, no throne of gold. If someone leads, he doesn't live in a bigger house. He doesn't speak louder. He doesn't occupy the top of the hill. He just walks a little ahead and stops a little slower. In this city, the center is not a place, but a habit. Not a building, but a meeting point. Sometimes people gather in one place because the sun feels cool there. Then, the next day, they gather in another place because the wind is cooler from the other direction. The city center moves with the seasons, with the shadows, with the voices of children who are more lively in one corner, and everyone knows where to go without being told, because this city moves without command, and that's precisely why it survives. When planning outlasts inhabitants, there was no earthquake, there was no great flood, there was no invasion of troops, there was no fire, but the city, one day, stopped being used. The houses were abandoned, the market became empty, the barns were boarded up, and never opened again. Not because of destruction, but because of displacement. Maybe the rivers dried up. Maybe the fields became barren. Maybe they just wanted a new place. But the city was not demolished. It was left alone, slowly covered with dust, buried in sand. Grass grew slowly, but not stopped. And beneath it all, the plan remained intact. The water channels were still straight. The street plan could still be traced. The stones of the houses were still aligned. The city died, but it did not disappear, because the plan was a trace of silence that could not be burned. Now the city is gone. There may be fields on it, or a small village, or ruins that are considered ordinary, but the city is still alive if you know how to listen. It lives in every empty space that you leave empty, in every narrow alley that you pass without hurrying, in every smell that you do not hide, and in every place that you guard, even though you do not use it. The ancient city did not teach us technology. It taught us patience and silence, and sometimes that is what we need most. Thank you for listening. If you have not fallen asleep, may you fall asleep now. And if you have fallen asleep, may you dream of a city that was not built to be seen, but to be lived in. Please subscribe to this channel if you want to continue to accompany your sleep with boring things from the past. Until next night, and don't worry, the city still exists, even if you don't know where it is.